so much for joining, and thank you to all of our witnesses and, of course, my colleagues for joining us. Today's briefing is about the extraordinary effort underway to develop a vaccine to prevent COVID-19. A safe and effective vaccine could hasten the end to this disastrous pandemic. But the herd immunity that will end COVID-19 once and for all requires all of us to get vaccinated. For that, we need public trust in this entire vaccine project. Around the globe, nearly 200 vaccine candidates are being developed, and over 20 have entered human clinical trials. In the United States, 5 have entered human clinical trials, with large clinical trials to begin later this month. With a historic all-hands-on-deck effort underway around the globe, the timeline to develop a vaccine may be compressed from several years down to just 12 or 18 months. However, moving with this amazing speed does not and must not allow for cutting any corners. Today, we will hear how we must place trust in the Food and Drug Administration's tried and tested vaccine review process. We will learn how this process remains the best in the world, and we will hopefully, through this process, produce a COVID-19 vaccine in record time. While this nation's scientific workforce spends late nights in their labs to produce a vaccine, we in Congress must do our part to protect their work from political meddling, so that they can uphold their profession's utmost standards of scientific analysis and ethics. We are not here today to place bets on the vaccine horse race. We leave the careful assessment of individual vaccines to the experts. We must entrust science to the scientists, not the politicians. I want to highlight 2 guardrails that protect the integrity of vaccine development and will ensure the safety and efficacy of a COVID-19 vaccine. First, the most important hurdle for a vaccine to be deemed safe and effective is to successfully undergo phase 3 human clinical trials. According to tradition as well as the science, phase 3 human clinical trials must include at least 30,000 people. This is a requirement endorsed by NIH Director Francis Collins and our top infectious diseases authority, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Second, FDA must receive and consider advice from what is called the Vaccine and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee, also known as VRBPAC. In the area of vaccines, VRBPAC has a sterling reputation, and for decades, it has played a central role in FDA's process for assessing new vaccines. Review of a COVID-19 vaccine by this body of vaccine experts from academia and industry will add transparency, public accountability, and scientific insight to the approval process. These are critical values for a vaccine that will undergo immense public scrutiny and require full participation and trust by the public. However, up to this point, FDA has failed to commit to these 2 guardrails. With fellow oversight chairs Carolyn Maloney and Jim Clyburn, I wrote to FDA Commissioner Stephen Hahn asking for his commitment to a 30,000 trial participant requirement for stage 3 human trials, as well as engagement with VRBPAC. A month later, we have received no response. 2 weeks ago, FDA Commissioner Hahn testified to Congress that he would maintain his independence and the high standards of the FDA. Commitments to a 30,000 trial participation rate, as well as engagement with VRBPAC, would be concrete ways to guarantee that independence and rigor. We must remain vigilant to the risk that politics will infiltrate the regulatory process. This subcommittee showed how that risk manifested itself in antibody testing. After the FDA chose not to regulate antibody tests at all, following criticism of its handling of diagnostic tests, hundreds of junk tests have flooded the market. The virus does not yield an inch to political tactics or media campaigns. It does not follow consumer sentiment or approval ratings. The impending election, the stock market, and the yearning for a return to normalcy must not distort the decision on whether or not to approve a vaccine. We must expedite developing a vaccine, but we cannot cut corners in the process. With that, I would now like to I'd like to recognize the full committee chair, Carolyn Maloney, for her opening remarks. And thank you, Chairwoman Maloney, for joining us as well.
Thank you, and thank you to all of my colleagues. And I especially want to thank each of our witnesses for joining us this morning. Today, we will hear from experts about the importance of promoting transparency to ensure that the coronavirus vaccine FDA eventually approves is safe and effective. We are fortunate to have such a distinguished panel of public health experts before the subcommittee today, and I am grateful that you have taken time out of your schedules to share your insights with us. I would like to take a moment to recognize Dr. Jason Schwartz of the Yale School of Public Health. I had the privilege of hosting him last May for a vaccine roundtable at Hunter College in New York City. I am delighted to see you again, Dr. Schwartz. Thank you for joining us. And finally, I want to really commend the leadership of Chairman Krishnamoorthi in convening today's briefing to ensure that a safe and effective coronavirus vaccine is developed and made available to the American people following the protocols of the FDA to ensure safety for our people. I am so grateful for your leadership, and I am grateful to be a partner with you on this very critical issue, and I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chairwoman Maloney. And sorry for the delay, folks. It's just a way to make sure that each of us gets unmuted so that you can hear us when we talk. Now I'd like to turn it over to Ranking Member Cloud for your opening remarks, sir. If you'd like to, if someone could unmute Congressman Cloud.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We're good. Thank you, Chairman Krishnamoorthi, for holding this hearing. This is certainly an important topic as we are dealing with a pandemic that has ravaged our nation and indeed the world. It's important that we come together and address these healthcare issues very intentionally. I would note just right off the top that we have the ability now to hold hearings as opposed to briefings, hearings which would follow rules. And I would just request that as the majority considers future hearings, that we would conduct them in a format that would protect minority rights. Over the last few months, our country, of course, has been affected by this, and Congress has provided $3 billion for research and development in vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics for COVID-19 through the CARES Act. The Trump administration has worked tirelessly so that our country can overcome the unprecedented challenges this virus poses and ensure that we find the best therapeutics to treat COVID-19 and can develop a vaccine in record time. To this end, President Trump initiated Operation Warp Speed, which empowered our government to work with the private sector to manufacture 300 million doses of an approved vaccine with the goal of having those by January 2021. To this end, President Trump because of this immense effort, the government and pharmaceutical companies, the U.S. is on track to have an effective vaccine widely available by the end or early 2021. This, of course, is an incredible feat. In contrast or in context, the H1N1 vaccine was developed in 6 months, but it relied on nearly 70 years of flu vaccine research. It took 8 years to develop an Ebola vaccine. The American public should rest assured that the administration and industry partners are not sacrificing safety or efficacy while developing this vaccine. We will not be cutting corners in the development of this vaccine. Instead, Operation Warp Speed enables steps in the vaccine process to happen simultaneously. It doesn't skip steps, it just allows them to be done simultaneously. This does increase the cost of production. Drug companies and the federal government have partnered together to cover the cost so that we can get a vaccine to market faster. Just last week, the federal government announced 2 new contracts, one with Regeneron and the other with Novavax. Both of these companies have agreed the doses manufactured under these projects will be owned by the federal government, meaning that if this vaccine is proven effective, the US government would make the doses available to Americans at no cost. Other companies like Moderna, Janssen, and AstraZeneca have pledged to set low prices on any vaccine approved. The goal is that between the low prices and existing programs, that no one would go without a vaccine who wants one. Finally, ensuring equitable access to the vaccine once developed is key. The CDC has been working since April to develop a ranking system for vaccine distribution. Those serving on the front lines, like our medical professionals, those with underlying conditions, and those over 65 will likely get the first doses, ensuring that our most vulnerable are protected. I look forward to hearing from the panelists today on how we can ensure the public trusts the vaccine and has access to it once it's developed. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Hey, thank you so much, Ranking Member Cloud, and it's great to have you at this hearing, and I really appreciate your remarks. I think we're much better off when everyone's participating and asking the tough questions, and that produces a real robust conversation, so thank you. Let me now turn to our briefers. We have 5 witnesses. I'm just going to quickly say their names, and then I'm going to turn it to Dr. Gellin. But we have Dr. Gellin, Dr. Goodman, Dr. Karen, Dr. Schwartz, and Dr. Bhattacharya. We are now going to start with Dr. Gellin. You are now recognized for 5 minutes. There's a timer on your screen, and I appreciate you all and all of us sticking to our 5 minutes. So with that, Dr. Gellin, you are now recognized.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Good morning. I'll look for that timer. Thanks. Good morning, Chairman Krishnamoorthi and members of the subcommittee. Thanks for this important discussion today and for the work that you've already done to ensure that the response to the COVID-19 pandemic is guided by the best science and the best scientists. I'm Dr. Bruce Gellin. I currently serve as President of Global Immunization at the Sabin Vaccine Institute here in Washington, founded in honor of Dr. Albert Sabin, the inventor of the oral polio vaccine. And our mission at Sabin is to make vaccines more accessible, enable innovation, and expand immunization across the globe. My entire career, spent largely in the government, has been vaccine focused at CDC and NIH, and for 15 years as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Health and Director of the National Vaccine Program Office at HHS. As we've heard already, we're all too familiar with the startling and deeply disturbing statistics of this pandemic. The US continues to experience record numbers of infections, and the virus has taken a disproportionate number of American lives. And beyond the obvious health impacts, no sector of society has been spared, and the full economic and social reckoning will be grim, though still difficult to predict. And while the various efforts to flatten the curve, social distancing, hand washing, and face coverings are all important to help to control this virus, it's absolutely clear that only population-wide immunity will dampen the virus's ongoing spread and end the pandemic. Let me repeat, only population-wide immunity will stop the spread of COVID-19 and end the pandemic. As you mentioned, there has been an unprecedented effort to develop and deploy vaccines for the US population and around the globe. This has been extraordinary and marked by collaboration, innovation, and speed. The focus of today's briefing is how we ensure that all of this results in vaccines that are both safe and effective. In addition to good science, which is always a good starting point, I'd suggest there are 3 crucial elements that are fundamental to the success of this effort: no shortcuts, transparency, and trust. Let me elaborate briefly. The development of successful human vaccines from idea to licensure is a complex and lengthy process. But in response to this public health emergency, a number of steps have already been taken where steps can be taken in parallel rather than in sequence to shorten these timelines without sacrificing a thorough assessment of safety and efficacy. The FDA is to be commended for publishing a detailed guidance document on the development of COVID-19 vaccines. Guidances like these, while directed to industry, are really for all to see. So all know the considerations that go into the process. But there's worry that the pressure to rush these vaccines to the American people at warp speed may have well-intended, but misguided desires to shorten those timelines. Shortcuts could shortchange the process, and we all know that cutting corners comes with a price. And the consequences of such a misstep here, such as the failure to detect a safety signal that wasn't expected, would have serious implications. Not only do we risk that people will decline vaccination, we risk much more, that the trust of the American people in the very process we've come here to discuss. A recent poll found that only half the US adult population would take a COVID-19 vaccine. A third aren't sure, and 1 in 5 said absolutely not. These results are a window into the confidence the American public has about this process. In 1972, Congress passed the Federal Advisory Committee Act. Advisory committees enlist our country's best experts to provide their independent advice to government, and these meetings are open to the public. And because transparency is an important element in the trust equation, I strongly recommend that any vaccine that's being considered for any type of approval by the FDA be reviewed in an open public meeting of FDA's Vaccine and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee. As a past participant in that committee, I can assure you about the robust discussions that they would have. But without such a public review, I have no doubt that stories will appear about vaccine approvals made behind closed doors because the government didn't want the public to see what or who may have influenced those decisions. Those stories are impossible to stop, and the best antidote would be sunshine. And while we're here today to talk about the processes in place to make a vaccine would be safe and effective, we should also acknowledge that we're here today to talk about trust. Trust in the research and development process that leads to vaccine licensures, trust in the vaccine policy process by which vaccines are recommended, trust in the providers who recommend and administer vaccines to their patients, and trust that once vaccines are used broadly in the population, that there's a system in place that continues to assess their safety and effectiveness. In the end, Americans want to know and understand what the process is, and they want to be assured that the process is being followed and not short-circuited. They need to have all this to build the trust and confidence that has been eroding over vaccines and vaccinations for some time, so that when they come to weigh their decision of the benefits and risks, they will choose to be vaccinated when a vaccine becomes available. I have no doubt that when a vaccine is available, the vaccination campaign in the US will be visible to all Americans. And given some of the frustrations and delays with critical elements of the pandemic response to date, let's not repeat that pattern. It's not too late to put a plan in place and communicate to all who want and need to know. People are tired of hearing that we're building the ship as we're sailing it. Let's build it, then sail it. Nobody wants it to sink. So in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, the guardrails to ensure a safe and effective vaccine go beyond compliance with the rules and regulations. Compliance alone will not assure a successful campaign that will then end this pandemic. There must be transparency in the vaccine development process. There can be no shortcuts, and trust must be built or rebuilt among the government, vaccine developers, and the public. And we need to get started on all of these now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gellin. Next, I'd like to recognize Dr. Goodman. You have 5 minutes.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great. Good morning, Chairman Krishnamoorthi and other committee members. I'm Jesse Goodman, an infectious disease physician and professor at Georgetown. I was formerly FDA's chief scientist, and in that capacity helped lead many public health responses. Before that, I directed FDA's Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, the very center that assesses and monitors vaccines for US use. I do appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Public health measures, diagnostics, and treatments can save lives, but only vaccines, as we've heard, offer the potential to provide widespread immunity and stop this outbreak before it simply burns through the world's population. For this reason, there are unprecedented efforts to accelerate vaccine development that we've heard about. However, vaccine development and manufacturing are complex, success is never assured, and while we can speed the process, we must not cut corners. We must ensure any COVID vaccines are safe and effective and maintain public trust, which is already threatened. To do so, FDA's independence should be protected and the agency must uphold and be transparent about its standards and scientific decision-making. In a recent JAMA article, colleagues and I outlined 4 safeguards needed in COVID-19 vaccine development. First, we need strong evidence of effectiveness. This is best accomplished through large controlled clinical trials involving thousands of individuals that compare rates of illness in vaccinated and controlled groups. To ensure vaccines work in those who need the most, trials must include diverse populations, as well as the elderly and those with chronic conditions. FDA recently published guidance that vaccines should be at least 50% effective, a reasonable starting point. It's important to emphasize that effectiveness of COVID vaccines is not a given, as it has not been easy to make vaccines against other coronaviruses, and immunity may wane quickly. Second, we need strong evidence of safety. Unlike treatments given to the sick, vaccines are given to the healthy and must be extremely safe. This is a novel disease for which we have no vaccine precedents, and many candidates are based on novel technologies not yet utilized in approved vaccines. To ensure that benefits outweigh risk, pre-approval safety databases should include at least several thousand individuals. In addition, once safety in general population is documented, studies should move ahead in pregnant women, given the risks they face in their roles in healthcare and other essential workforces. Third, we need to be very thoughtful about any vaccine access prior to approval. There may be circumstances where use of an unapproved vaccine could be appropriate in a severe outbreak. For example, if a vaccine with documented safety and promising effectiveness were available, but all the data needed not yet submitted, FDA could provide access through an expanded access program or through an emergency use authorization or EUA. EUAs are designed to enable flexible responses in public health emergencies, but have a lower evidence requirement than FDA's normal safe and effective standard. That is, that a product may be effective and that likely known and potential benefits outweigh risk. However, experience has shown the public may interpret an EUA as the same as an approval. If a vaccine used under an EUA turns out to be ineffective or raise safety concerns, and users are unclear the vaccine was unapproved, a crisis could occur, undermining confidence in all vaccines. Therefore, if a vaccine is used before approval, we suggest informed consent be part of the process, even under an EUA, and that use be targeted to those at highest risk of infection and complications. The final needed safeguard is a robust monitoring system to track safety as vaccines are rolled out. Very serious adverse events may not be detected in pre-approval studies. Also, when a vaccine is administered broadly, common events will occur coincidentally after vaccination, but it's critical to be sure they're not vaccine related. For the 2009 H1N1 pandemic vaccines, a system capturing government and private sector data was stood up and tracked millions of vaccine doses, helping ensure and communicate the vaccines were safe. We need such a system in place now, not later, with global links and full transparency about how safety will be monitored and communicated. In conclusion, while working to get COVID vaccines quickly, these safeguards are required to ensure they will be safe, effective, and trusted. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Goodman. Next, Dr. Karen, have I pronounced your name properly?
Yes, you have.
Okay, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you and good morning, Mr. Chairman and committee members. My name is Ruth Karen. I'm a pediatrician trained in infectious diseases and a professor at the Bloomberg School of Public Health, where I lead the Center for Immunization Research and the Johns Hopkins Vaccine Initiative. My work has focused on respiratory virus vaccines and vaccine policy and ethics. With respect to COVID-19 vaccines, I'm on the DSMB for the Moderna phase 2 vaccine trial and will likely be a co-investigator for 2 other vaccine trials scheduled to begin this summer. I also had the honor and privilege of serving on 2 federal advisory committees. I served as chair of VRPAC and also served on ACIP, the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. More than 3 million Americans have been infected with SARS-CoV-2, and more than 137,000 have died. This virus has profoundly affected us all, but it has been especially devastating for the elderly, the poor, and for racial and ethnic minorities. Development and deployment of COVID-19 vaccines is essential, since vaccines will be our best tool to control and ultimately end this pandemic. This is not a competition, but a yes and moment. Testing multiple vaccines now will increase the chances that we will have effective vaccines in sufficient quantity to protect people in our country and worldwide. We need to make sure that diverse populations are included in vaccine trials so that we have the necessary safety and efficacy data to inform decisions about vaccine authorization, licensure, and use. We also need to plan for the careful, open, and transparent evaluation of all trial data so that we can use these vaccines safely and effectively to protect all members of our society. VRBPAC's advice will be critical as the FDA reviews vaccine trial data and makes decisions about emergency use authorizations and licensure. VRBPAC's input on trial design, review of trial data, and recommendations for licensure serve two very important purposes. The public and the FDA have the opportunity to hear the thinking, questions, and concerns of some of our country's leading independent vaccine scientists. Equally important, the FDA and VRBPAC members have the opportunity to hear and respond to the public's concerns in an open public forum. This fall and winter, safety and efficacy data will be emerging from COVID-19 vaccine trials. As Dr. Goodman just described, decisions may need to be made about issuing EUAs for one or more vaccines with data that are promising but incomplete. Questions about risk and benefit, either for entire populations or for high-risk subgroups, must be discussed by VRBPAC using all available data with clear acknowledgement of what is known and what is yet unknown. Decisions about licensure of COVID-19 vaccines must also be made with VRBPAC engagement, review, and advice. We also need to make certain that vaccine safety and efficacy information reviewed by FDA and VRBPAC is representative of our society, which means that trials must include volunteers from diverse racial, ethnic, geographic, and age groups. In particular, we need to ensure that Black, Latinx, and Native American populations, who are far more likely to become infected with the virus and far more likely to die from COVID, are not only offered opportunities to participate in these vaccine trials, but also choose to participate in them. For this to happen, we must acknowledge the high levels of mistrust that exist in many communities and work urgently to engage communities, build trust, and ensure that vaccines will be free and readily available. We must also have a clear plan to meet the needs of pregnant women. A recent CDC report indicates that pregnant women, particularly Black and Latina women, may be at increased risk for hospitalization and ICU admission. If we don't have at least one vaccine to offer to pregnant women, then we can't protect all of our essential workers, because pregnant women are doctors, nurses, and EMTs, police, teachers, and nursing home aides, grocery store workers, and factory workers. We need to plan for systematic data collection from women who become pregnant during upcoming vaccine trials, require vaccine manufacturers to perform DART studies as needed, and engage experts in obstetrics, pediatrics, and research ethics in designing studies to include pregnant women. Building confidence in COVID-19 vaccines is essential because the best vaccine in the world won't work if it isn't used. We must begin by developing trust in the clinical trials process and providing open, transparent, independent expert review and analysis of clinical trial data for decisions about vaccine licensure or emergency use authorization. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Karen. Next, Dr. Schwartz, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Krishnamoorthi and members of the subcommittee. My name is Jason Schwartz. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management at the Yale School of Public Health. A central focus of my research is U.S. vaccination policy and policy making, particularly how evidence informs the development of vaccine regulation, financing, promotion, and delivery by government public health agencies. My primary message for today's briefing is as follows. We are facing a public health crisis unlike any that anyone alive today has experienced, and the speed and urgency surrounding vaccine development is similarly unprecedented. However, the closer that our government health agencies adhere to their well-established, time-tested processes for evaluating the safety and effectiveness of COVID-19 vaccines and developing evidence-based approaches for their deployment, the more confidence the public can have in the integrity and quality of those decisions and those vaccines, and the more likely it will be that COVID-19 vaccination programs approach the incredibly high expectations being placed upon them. This is no time for improvisation. In the United States, we are fortunate to have an extremely robust and well-functioning system for rigorously and continuously evaluating the safety and effectiveness of vaccines before and after their initial approval, and producing widely respected evidence-based guidelines for their use. This expertise resides principally within the FDA Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's National Center for Immunization and Respiratory Diseases. These career government scientists have unrivaled expertise required for the work regarding COVID-19 vaccines that lies ahead, and their activities can be further supported by the long-standing external expert advisory committees that have for decades supported the government's regulatory and policy-making work around vaccines. I'm referring specifically to the Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee at the FDA and the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices at the CDC. For over 50 years, advisory committees have been regular and influential contributors to the FDA in supporting its core regulatory responsibilities related to the review of vaccines, pharmaceuticals, and other products. These committees provide the FDA with access to preeminent scientists and physicians from outside of the federal government who assemble to review evidence and offer recommendations regarding the actions the FDA should take. Advisory committees expand the expertise available to support FDA's decision-making and are thought to increase the perceived legitimacy of its decisions. While the FDA is not required to follow the recommendations of its advisory committees, it most often does. FDA advisory committees, as we've heard, also help to enhance the transparency of its decision-making. In accordance with the provisions of the Federal Advisory Committee Act, advisory committee meetings largely occur in public, giving members of the public and other interested stakeholders opportunities to see relevant evidence regarding the safety and effectiveness of products, to observe committee deliberations, and to comment directly to the committee and the FDA staff who participate in these meetings. This kind of transparency can be extremely helpful in allaying concerns about the grounds for FDA's decisions or potential allegations regarding interference in its scientific assessments and decision-making. With respect to vaccines, VRBPAC has been an active contributor to FDA's work since its creation in 1981, as my colleagues on today's panel can speak to firsthand. As COVID-19 vaccines move ahead in their development, these efforts should continue to balance the obvious urgency of the work with an insistence that there can be no compromises with respect to the safety and effectiveness evidence expected of any vaccine in order for it to be authorized or approved for use. It's encouraging that statements from FDA leadership have thus far appeared sensitive to this challenge and this responsibility. There are extremely difficult scientific and policy questions ahead regarding the evaluation and use of COVID-19 vaccines. Questions that will benefit from more eyes, more perspectives, more expertise, more institutional knowledge, more transparency, not less. Adhering to long-standing practices and norms for assessing the safety and effectiveness of vaccines in general and in specific populations, including the participation of the FDA and CDC's expert advisory committees, meeting and deliberating openly as they have done for decades, would enhance health agencies' decision-making and public confidence in the vaccines so eagerly anticipated. Public confidence in vaccines is fragile and has been under growing threat in recent years. While no pre-approval evidence review process, no matter how rigorous, can eliminate the possibility of unfavorable evidence emerging after a vaccine is approved and widely administered, the actions taken by the FDA and its counterparts in the months ahead can greatly reduce that possibility. The emergence of a serious safety concern related to a COVID-19 vaccine, or even the perception by the public that corners were cut or political pressure was applied in a rush to approve it, would be greatly damaging not only to COVID-19 vaccination efforts, but also to public confidence in all recommended vaccines. And our already overwhelmed public health and healthcare systems cannot bear the burden of simultaneously battling COVID-19 alongside outbreaks of measles, influenza, and other vaccine-preventable diseases in the months and years to come. Thank you to the members of the subcommittee for your interest in these issues and for the invitation to participate in today's briefing.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Schwartz. Now, Dr. Bhattacharya, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. So good morning, Chairman Krishnamoorthi, Ranking Member Cloud, and other committee members, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Jay Bhattacharya. I'm a health economist and a professor of medicine at Stanford University School of Medicine, where I direct the Center for Demography and Economics of Health and Aging. I have 20 years of experience working on economics of infectious disease with many published papers on H1N1 flu, H5N1 flu, and also on SARS-CoV-2. In addition to my academic work, I've worked closely with federal regulatory agencies, both CMS on issues related to physician payment, access to care, quality of care, and I've worked for the last several years with the FDA with the Center for Biologics Evaluation Research on post-market surveillance of biological products, including safety of the flu vaccine. Today, I want to address two topics related to vaccine development in the context of COVID-19. First, the safety of SARS-CoV-2 vaccines currently under development, and then second, the policy mechanisms to prioritize access to the vaccines by vulnerable populations, should they prove safe and effective. So as the other experts have said, and we all know, the development of vaccine candidates at SARS-CoV-2 has proceeded at an absolutely remarkable pace. In a report released just yesterday, the World Health Organization identified 23 candidate vaccines currently in clinical evaluation, meaning tested on human populations, and 137 vaccine candidates in preclinical evaluation. The vaccine candidates employ a variety of technologies, both traditional and novel, all with the same goal of producing a sustained antibody response that can neutralize SARS-CoV-2 virus and prevent COVID-19 infection. This is, in my experience, an absolutely extraordinary scientific effort in an incredibly short period of time in response to the challenge posed by the COVID-19 epidemic. The rapid development of these vaccine candidates naturally brings with it worries, and you've heard some here, about the safety of the ultimately approved vaccine. And these are not idle worries, as vaccines are biologically potent agents and need to be tested thoroughly in a very wide population before they're deployed widely. At the same time, even discredited challenges of the safety of vaccine, and like in the case of the MMR vaccine, can lead many people to avoid vaccination with unfortunate consequences in the spread of deadly disease. So I want to, on this point, say two things to address you and the American public about the process that I've seen that the FDA follow on the safety of SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. First, in my experience working with CBER, which is the part of the FDA that will be evaluating the safety of the vaccine candidates for SARS-CoV-2, and I've worked with them for several years, I found the FDA scientists and epidemiologists who worked on biologics and drug safety to be among the most careful and conscientious researchers I've ever worked with and I've ever encountered. They are absolutely immune from political influence, and they follow the data diligently in their decision making. They will look at the data, and they care deeply about safety. The FDA in the last on June 30th issued a set of guidelines for industry regarding what they expect to see from the trials that are going to be run regarding the vaccines. Among the sets of guidelines include rigorous standards about safety, rigorous standards about effectiveness, a very, very high effectiveness standard, in fact, a 50% effectiveness standard against placebo in a placebo-controlled trial in phase 3, and thousands of people enrolled in each trial to match statistical standards of safety signals. Traditionally, the CBER requires at least 3,000 people enrolled in the trial. They're going to expect more than that, many, many more than that for this trial, for these trials. Of course, they can't mandate that the industry follow these standards, but of course, the FDA will be evaluating trials on the basis of what's reported. In addition, the standards in the June 30th guideline put out by the FDA say that populations like elderly folks, elderly populations, people with chronic diseases, and people with pregnant women, minority populations, all must be enrolled in sufficient numbers so that the safety signals can be detected in those populations during the trial. In addition to the trials themselves, if the vaccine candidates are proved safe and effective, there's extensive post-market surveillance both in the June 30th guidelines and also in the traditional practice of the FDA to monitor the safety of the vaccines after they've been approved and put into use. Whenever you have a vaccine approved and used by millions of people, you naturally would expect that there would be some signals you find outside, and that the FDA will work very actively to assure that those will be found and acted on. The last thing I wanted to address is the Operation Warp Speed. As you know, this is the administration's plan to accelerate research and development for efforts in the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine. To my knowledge, the operation has two main parts. One, to provide financial support for studies for the safety and efficacy of the most promising vaccine candidates. That's played an important role in the acceleration of the research and development efforts for the vaccines. And then to make financial commitments for the large-scale production of vaccine doses even before the regulatory process for drug approval is complete. The main thing I want to emphasize about the first part is the studies will be conducted will be evaluated by the FDA regulatory process I just mentioned. Cutting corners on safety evaluation will be utterly impossible in my view under the FDA's flag. Second part, the financial commitments for the large-scale production of vaccine doses even before the regulatory process is complete, in a sense is a gamble. What if we invest a large amount of money to manufacture a vaccine that after the study is complete turns out not to work very well? That's the downside. The upside is the vaccine is safe and effective and it works. Tens of millions of doses will be available, and we will not need to fight so hard over who gets the first doses among the limited supply. This is a big gamble, that makes enormous amount of sense given the huge economic costs and health harms of the COVID-19 epidemic. I think these, in a sense, the Operation Warp Speed is independent of the FDA process. In fact, completely independent. What it does is it avoids the fight over who gets the vaccines first if the vaccine turns out to work. The process, the FDA process, makes it so that we understand if the vaccine is safe and effective. And if it's not, then that will turn out to be a wasted investment. But just like in any gamble, you have to, if it works out right, you win. If it works out wrong, you lose. Here, the loss is much smaller than the potential gain if the vaccine turns out to be good. And let me just finish with a last bit about at least this is only my own 2 cents about who should get the vaccines first. There's an enormous amount of clinical evidence that suggests that the elderly and people with multiple comorbid conditions are at high risk of the highest risk of mortality from COVID-19 infection. I believe that these groups should be prioritized for vaccine for the vaccine. Operation Warp Speed will make it so that the fight over who gets the vaccine, should the vaccine prove safe and effective, will be less of a political less of a political harm. There's been a lot of political clash over a wide range of issues regarding COVID-19, and I believe all Americans in the world can celebrate together if and when a safe and effective vaccine is developed. I think Operation Lightspeed will help make that a celebration rather than a political fight that was for many other aspects of COVID-19. I hope the vaccine comes soon, and I appreciate the comments of the appreciate to talk to the community.
Thank you, Doctor, and thank you to all the witnesses. Now we'll begin the Q&A. And as a reminder, each member will have 5 minutes to do their questioning, and we'll try to observe that so that all members can ask their questions in a timely manner. Once recognized, please wait for confirmation that you have been unmuted before asking your question. Several times I've seen in the past people start talking before anyone can hear them, and it looks like a silent movie. So we don't need that. We will try to wait before starting the questioning. I would like to first recognize myself for questions. Dr. Karen, you talked about VRBPAC. This sounds like some obscure, strange committee that exists in the government, but as someone mentioned, it was created when President Ronald Reagan first took office. It's been around for almost 40 years. Please introduce us to VRBPAC. What kinds of people sit on this committee, and what is its reputation?
So its reputation, maybe I'll begin with that, is for really providing unbiased, careful assessment of data and communicating that to the FDA and to the public. Typically, members of VRBPAC have a wide range of expertise. It ranges from basic science pediatrics, internal medicine, obstetrics, biostatistics. And these people come from academia. They may come from public health backgrounds. There's also a consumer representative and an industry representative.
It sounds like one of the biggest positive aspects of VRBPAC is that it has public deliberations, so that there's wide scale understanding of what's going on. Would you agree with that sentiment?
I completely agree. And I think it's both that the public can understand, it's a two-way process, and the public can also make their concerns heard, because it could be that VRBPAC members or the FDA have not yet heard what is really concerning the public.
Very good. And would you agree that VRBPAC should be engaged for the process that's currently underway for determining a safe and effective COVID-19 vaccine?
I would absolutely agree. Yes.
I'm extremely concerned. I want to turn to another topic, which is I'm extremely concerned that the FDA may choose to prematurely grant an emergency use authorization, also known as an EUA, to a vaccine for COVID-19, just like it did for hydroxychloroquine, a decision that the FDA later revoked. We've heard about Operation Warp Speed, but I'm concerned about EUAs being handed out at warp speed, and certainly in the context of COVID-19 vaccines. Dr. Goodman, under current law, does the commissioner have the authority to issue an EUA before the completion of a stage 3 clinical trial?
Yes, the regulations around emergency use authorization are extremely flexible. They simply require a public health emergency that's declared at the secretarial level, and then an FDA assessment of the science, which should be independent, that says the likely benefits of using a product for an otherwise unmet need are likely to exceed the risk. So there is a lot of flexibility there.
Got it. Dr. Schwartz, do you think that an emergency use authorization should be issued before the completion of a stage 3 clinical trial?
I would be concerned for the reasons Dr. Goodman mentioned in his opening statement, that an emergency use authorization would not be understood among the public to be different from the full approval and all that entails from the FDA, and that moving forward, introducing more widely a vaccine without kind of evidence that we want to have around safety and effectiveness would be taking a very serious gamble. So I would be very concerned about that as a general problem.
And you'd be concerned because you think that it would be potentially dangerous?
I think we'd be moving forward with less evidence than we'd like to have, which for vaccines, the importance of clear confidence in their safety is paramount, and an EUA would mean moving forward in all likelihood with less evidence than we would typically have, certainly than we would expect for full approval.
So you'd have a strong preference that the vaccine go through the full approval process, including VRBPAC, before any kind of EUA or any approval were granted?
Yes, and I'd like to see VRBPAC, if an EUA were to be considered, VRBPAC could absolutely and should be part of those conversations as well. There's a place for them no matter which path the FDA may consider in the months ahead.
Dr. Gellin, based on what we saw with hydroxychloroquine, do you have any concerns about the issuance of EUAs here?
No, I think that, the mantra of the FDA, if you ask them any questions, show us the data. And so I think that's what it's about. So the phase 3 trial, as you heard, is the robust opportunity to take a look at a large segment of the population. That's what's needed to be able to make a responsible decision.
Got it. Dr. Karen, one last question. There have been reports recently that convalescent plasma with COVID-19 antibodies have the potential in conferring immunity before they get the coronavirus. And Dr. Fauci recently called it a very attractive concept. Do you think the federal government should be exploring avenues such as convalescent plasma even before a vaccine arrives?
So I think this harkens back to my yes and comment. It not only applies to the multitude of vaccines, but it applies to the multitude of these countermeasures. So whether plasma or whether monoclonal antibodies, I think both of these approaches are promising, and yes, we should pursue all of these avenues.
Very good. My time has expired. Let me recognize, I think Ranking Member Cloud is still with us.
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can't see you yet. Oh, there you
Hello,
are.
hello,
Okay,
hello.
very good.
Hey, thank you,
I
Chairman.
I recognize you now for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. Appreciate your time, your research, your years of service in science, and for being here today to help us out with this. Dr. Bhattacharya, has Operation Warp Speed eliminated any steps in the vaccine approval process?
Not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge.
It's my understanding that Operation Warp Speed has enabled a speedier process by simultaneously running through the process of clinical trials to help us get to a vaccine quicker than normal. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. It basically allows the process for manufacturing and the trial process to run in parallel, whereas in the usual process, you'd have to run the trial first and then do the manufacturing.
Now, I'm sure you could probably take 45 minutes on this, but for a record and public view, could you kind of compare and contrast what a normal process is versus what the administration's approach is in this time?
I mean, a normal process wouldn't involve federal investment in the R&D directly, as they've done with Operation Warp Speed. A normal process would involve phase 3 trials, just like we're seeing with the vaccine candidates that are currently most advanced. The normal process would involve FDA guidance to the manufacturers about those trials, just like we've seen in the detailed guidance, the June 30th guidance that the FDA has provided to manufacturers about what they expect to see in the trial. A normal process normally wouldn't say things like we expect at least 50% efficacy. That's extraordinary. That's a higher standard than normally would be expected. I think it's because of the FDA. The FDA has I think signaled very clearly that they expect high standards for this vaccine, both in terms of efficacy and safety through their June 30th guidance. And that, in a sense, this goes beyond the normal process. A normal process, you wait to see, and you can imagine a business wouldn't say, I'm going to start manufacturing this product even before I see if it works. Operation Warp Speed makes that happen, says, look, let's start manufacturing those products even before we know they work. And
The vials and needles and such, right?
Actually, also the product itself.
Right.
And so if it doesn't work, it's investment wasted. If it does work, it vastly speeds up the ability to deploy the vaccine at scale to the American population.
And you're a health economist, so part of the reason for the lengthy process is for companies to usually minimize financial risks, right? And the administration prioritizing saving lives over strategic financial risk is the goal here. Is that my understanding?
That is absolutely the goal of Operation Warp Speed. It's to make it so that the public is essentially providing incentives for drug manufacturers to do the studies, to do the work carefully with a regulatory process that makes sure that the thing that's ultimately produced is actually safe and effective. And if it is, then it's ready to deploy. If it's not, then we made a gamble and we lost. But it's just money that's lost, not lives. We don't make the gamble. We produce a vaccine that works. Then we have a massive political fight over who gets it first. Many lives are lost as a result.
Now, again, you're a health economist, so there's been a tendency sometimes in dealing with the seriousness of COVID to look only at COVID and not in the context of dealing with the COVID, but also the other impacts of lockdowns and shutdowns. Could you speak to some of the other health implications that we're seeing?
Sure. I mean, we've seen an extraordinary increase in the number of suicides. The lockdown has mental health effects for people, many people. We've seen delays in basic treatments, essential treatments, including vaccines, like in kids, other vaccines, not a COVID one. We've seen delays in cancer treatment, cancer for basic essential treatments have have been avoided. I suspect over the long haul, we're going to find a big increase in other health problems as a result of the lockdowns.
I have time for one more question. And I know you're a real scientist, not a political scientist, but there's been a lot of discussion about the potential politicization of getting a vaccine sooner than later. Assuredly, there would be a political benefit to saving lives sooner than later. Do you think there's also potentially a incentive for some to delay a process politically?
I would hope not. I mean, I think this is one issue where I mean, maybe I'm naive. I'm definitely naive, and I'm definitely not a political scientist, so in that sense, I am naive. But I would hope that people would come together and say, let's look at the data and see if we have an effective vaccine. Let's get it out to the public as soon as we possibly can. And I think
I agree.
I have a lot of confidence in the FDA scientists I've worked with to look at the data and evaluate it fairly.
Thank you very much. I agree. I do believe, I think hopefully all of us can agree that the data should drive the process. Thanks so much. I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Cloud. And now I'd like to recognize Chairwoman Maloney for 5 minutes of questions.
This hearing today. I want to thank all of our panelists for your dedication to science and for all your hard work and for being on our panel today. Operation Warp Speed has promised that a safe and effective coronavirus vaccine will be approved and that 300 million doses will be available by January 2021. And while we are all so eager for a vaccine to be developed and deployed, I am troubled by reports that there may be some political pressure on the FDA to cut corners. I am encouraged that our panelists have said that they do not believe that, but I do want to ask Dr. Geldin, what harm would come from cutting corners in the rush to bring a corona vaccine to market? Dr. Geldin.
Thank you. So I think we've heard a lot about the processes of vaccine development. And as we just heard, that part of the lengthy process is to reduce the financial risk. So I would think everything that can be done to collapse that time without without minimizing the risk of the product itself. As I mentioned, the data is what drives this process, and we need to make sure that all the data that comes from these clinical trials is thoroughly investigated, both in terms of the immune response, the assessment of the effectiveness, and particularly the assessment of safety. And worry that in the rush we might miss something that we'll look at in retrospect, and we can't really afford that.
Well, then, as a follow-up, how can we maintain an expedited timetable while completing all the steps needed to ensure a safe and effective vaccine?
One of the comments that Dr. Goodman made was about a process that was put in place 10 years ago with the H1N1 vaccine effort to have an independent group that's looking at the data as it occurs, looking at the safety data. It had an unfortunate name of the Vaccine Safety Risk Assessment Working Group, but its value was that it looked at the data that was coming in every month. It had a public process so that everyone could see what they were looking at. I think things like that would be really important so that the public can see what the scientists are seeing and to see if there are any signals.
Thank you. That's a good recommendation. It's imperative that safety comes first in vaccine development. And once a safe vaccine is developed, it must be deployed in a way that ensures equitable distribution, accessibility, affordability for all people in our country. And last month, the subcommittee chairman, Clyburn, and I wrote to HHS to request the administration's contracts with private companies for the development of coronavirus vaccines, diagnostics, and treatments. The federal government is investing billions of taxpayer dollars towards this research. We requested those contracts to better understand whether they include provisions to ensure affordability and prevent profiteering at the expense of the American people. Unfortunately, HHS has not yet complied with our request, so we will continue to pressed for this. Dr. Schwartz, I'd now like to turn to you, and it is great to see you again. What must be done to ensure that everyone in the United States has free access to the coronavirus vaccine?
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney. Yes, I think it's absolutely right that even after we overcome the scientific hurdles in vaccine research and development, there will be a tremendously difficult new set of challenges regarding production, distribution of these vaccines to achieve the benefits that we hope for them. That will require every bit as much investment and coordination and government leadership to think about the issues around deployment. And we have, particularly at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, a parallel group of experts with years of expertise to think about those allocation and distribution issues. And we need to make sure they're both empowered and that the government has the resources to purchase and deliver the vaccines at the scale we need them. So there's a tremendous amount of work that lies ahead if and when we're lucky enough to have a vaccine that shows the kind of promise that we're all hoping for.
And you're saying that the federal government is already planning and investing its resources now to ensure that a vaccine is deployed successfully?
I'm not so sure about the levels of investment, but I do know that expert advisors at the Centers for Disease Control are already thinking about these questions around prioritization in terms of how we might think about where the first doses, when we know we won't have nearly enough to meet demand, but where those first doses can go. That work is already moving forward, at least at the conceptual level, but it will need more than thinking and planning. It'll need the kinds of resources to scale up the vaccination program once, if and when we have a vaccine. So there's a lot of work needed and a lot of investment required.
And finally, once a vaccine is deployed, we will need to continue practicing social distancing and taking precautions such as masks as it is deployed. Is that correct?
Absolutely. A vaccine will be an invaluable supplement to the kinds of tools and responses that we're using and will continue to use for some time. It won't end the story in terms of how we respond to COVID-19, but it'll be a very valuable tool as we try and maximize the benefits of vaccines and maximize the benefits of all the other tools. So the story will continue with the vaccine as a really promising adjunct to the spectrum of public health responses that we know can be effective if they're thoroughly and faithfully followed by the public.
In closing, I thank the chairman and all the panelists once again for your leadership. And I thank you, Chairman, for holding this critically important briefing, and I yield back.
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney. Next, we are going to recognize Congressman Grothman. Are you with us? I thought I saw your...
Hey, when I'm back, now am I on? Can you hear me?
I hear you. I can't see you yet. Can you turn on your video?
Okay, here. Just a minute. We'll see if this will get it on here. Let me see. Here, just a minute. You have to go with me without my face. Let me see here. There we go. Oh, there. Now does that work? Oh, how does it work?
Not yet. Should we?
There I am. You see me now?
There you are. Yeah, we got you. We see you.
There we are. Okay, well, you're so friendly to me. You're so friendly, and I'm going to start off by kind of questioning something you said.
You're recognized for 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you. You started off by saying we have to, go with the experts, and my concern with that is frequently the experts vary. Right now in the United States, we might spend the most for healthcare for any country in the world, certainly more than a lot of other westernized nations. I think we take more medications than any other country in the world. And despite that, our life expectancy is not necessarily higher than other countries. So in other words, I think the experts are getting a lot in this country wrong. A doctor of mine is now retired, talked about pills and procedures. And we seem to have almost a blind faith in this country towards medications and more procedures. I think we have to remember that before we just, say that more is always better. I also think that throughout this coronavirus crisis, the so-called experts in the public health field, to me, have got a lot of things wrong. Okay, at least in this state, they told people to stay inside. I read experts saying we better outside, both for the fresh air and for the sunshine. I think they were overusing ventilators. I think they way overestimated the number of deaths. At least in my area, they were cleaning out the hospitals. You couldn't get what were considered to be elective procedures or that sort of thing, many of which were life-saving. And I think there are a lot of experts right now who may say that people died because we weren't doing certain procedures in hospitals, waiting for this deluge of patients that never showed up. And quite frankly, in my district, nurses were being laid off because the hospitals were emptied out. So I want you to remember throughout this that experts disagree. And I think the public health establishment is screwed up a lot in this right now. In my district, the people that I talk to, the more thoughtful people, will be very jaded about anything they come up with. But I'm going to ask in general, and I'll come back to this idea that we emptied out the hospitals, couldn't do a lot of things. We have some members of the panel. Could you tell us how the public health establishment screwed up there? Do you believe they did screw up when there's so many things they weren't doing in hospitals that could be life savings in anticipation of this big deluge of patients? And why should I be, and what should I tell the people back in my district when they are going to question the experts forever because they've been given so much bad advice from them in the past?
Is the question to me? I can try to address that. I think in the early days of the epidemic, there was quite a bit of uncertainty about, for instance, the death rate from the virus. The early models had the virus as way more infectious than it's turned out to be, the R0 number, and as a result, the lockdowns, I believe, happened earlier than they should have happened. I think the lockdowns are an important tool in some places where hospitals overrun. But as you know, many parts of the country have seen bankruptcy of hospitals because they've been emptied out and wait in anticipation of the virus when it didn't come until later. So I think the experts made enormous mistakes early on, and I think a lot of the skepticism is in that sense is warranted. I don't necessarily believe that we should stop looking at expertise, though. I do think that we can continue to try to look for good data. A debate among experts, not silencing experts that disagree, is a very, very important part of that. So I completely wholeheartedly agree with the spirit of it. There should be acknowledgement that experts disagree.
Okay, just one other comment, and then I'll let you guys go. Right now, somebody gave me a book, Plague of Corruption by Judy Mikovits, who is sometimes very pro-vaccine, sometimes jaded about vaccines. And, we have 5 people, I think, on the panel today, and nobody's particularly jaded the degree to which she is. I wondered if people feel that somebody like her should be on a panel today or be in the room as we rush vaccines to market. Could somebody comment on her? Or do you think it would be good to have somebody on a panel like this who maybe thinks we're a little bit over-vaccinated in America and isn't going to be so gung-ho vaccine everybody? We can ask you again.
I mean, I don't know her in particular, but I think that putting the best data out there and having transparency about what those data are, so that people kind of understand what the decisions are being based on, and then having an open public debate about it is really important.
A lot of, I think, intelligent people who read a lot are sometimes a little jaded on the vaccine thing, and I'm a little when everybody on the panels go.
If I could, Congressman, just comment briefly. I think that you've heard from all of us, and we've had careers dedicated to vaccines, our concerns about vaccine safety, and because there are legitimate concerns, and we want to be sure that everything is done so that when vaccines are available, there's confidence that there's been a process in place that ensures that they're safe and effective. So, and even on this panel, we have been quite clear about our concerns that everything be done to ensure those things. I think the other comment is, go ahead. You want it? I'll stop.
So I have to jump in. We're kind of going over here, but why don't the witness can finish the answer.
Just one last comment that what we're seeing now is extraordinary. We never heard of this virus 6 or 7 months ago, and now we have an unbelievable amount of science. We still have many questions, but the amount of science that's come forward has been remarkable. But watching science in real time can be confusing because every day you learn something else. You take a step forward, a step back, a step sideways. So we need to continue to look at that science and to look at it from a distance as we can. But I agree that looking at it every day makes it confusing when one study seems to say one thing and one says another. And we're going to need to assemble the best data to have a true understanding of where we are.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you so much for that line of questioning. Let me turn it now to Congresswoman Presley. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for directing our collective focus to this critical issue. I want to thank our esteemed panel of experts for joining us to ensure that our conversation is rooted in science, in public interest, and equity. And as a sidebar, I would like to go on record in saying, and Dr. Fauci, I trust. Today, I'm reminded of a doctor's solemn promise, the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. If we seek to develop a safe and effective vaccine, our approach to public health must prioritize that simple principle, do no harm. Unfortunately, the current but temporary occupant of the White House has spent his entire life cutting corners to get results that help him at the expense of others. We cannot allow that pattern in practice to compromise the ethics that guide our medical community. This pandemic has demonstrated more than any other time in our nation's history the need for a deliberate process that values equity and inclusion. According to data released by the CDC, Black and Latinx citizens are hospitalized at more than 4 times the rate of white Americans due to coronavirus. These are the same communities that are underrepresented in clinical trials. As health researchers and manufacturers hope to put an end to the harm caused by COVID-19, it is absolutely critical that their work is informed by those who are hardest hit. Operation Warp Speed needs to make time for health equity before it is too late. If the United States hopes to successfully emerge from the current health pandemic, every step of the process must be fair, inclusive, and equitable. Dr. Gellin, during clinical trials, why is it important to include volunteers from diverse communities?
We've heard, thank you. We've heard a lot about the size of the clinical trials, which is really important because it's the size of those trials, as you've heard from Dr. Goodman and Dr. Karen, allows you to look at population segments in that. If you're going to be recommending a vaccine for people, and in this one we expect that the recommendations will be for everyone, we'll have a discussion about the order, we want to make sure those vaccines work and are safe in these different populations. So unless you have sufficient numbers of each of those subsets, you may not have full confidence in how they'll perform when they're used more broadly.
Very good. So Dr. Gellin, how are communities of color, could you just elucidate us, how are communities of color typically engaged in the vaccine development process?
Well, and others will elaborate, and maybe Dr. Karen, who's doing these clinical trials all the time, will want to comment. But the vaccine development process obviously involves people, and the people are recruited as volunteers into studies, and that can be a challenge when volunteers do or do not want to enroll. In this effort, there needs to be a special effort to ensure that when we look at the broad swath of the population, that the clinical trials include representatives from those populations, so that we'll have the information on those segments. Whether
Sure.
they,
I'm sorry, and to your point, and I do want to call on Dr. Karen. I mean, certainly equity has to be centered in everything, but there is also real fear based on history. If you look at Henrietta Lacks or the Tuskegee experiment. So Dr. Karen, what are manufacturers and researchers doing now to ensure that we can get the data we need from historically underrepresented groups?
So I can speak to some of the work in particular that Warp Speed is doing and the Warp Speed investigators are doing. They are engaging now with community leaders, with members of faith organizations, with potential volunteers themselves to understand what their concerns are and how they can help allay those concerns and bringing, it's also very important. There are a few things they've identified. One very obvious and very important thing is that some of the study personnel also need to be part of those groups. They need to be approached, as they say, by people who look like them. Another key point, and it was one that I hope I highlighted in my remarks, is that many of these individuals have said, will I be able to get a vaccine at the end? Will my family, if I participate in these trials, will vaccine be freely available? So ultimate access is tied to early engagement.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Karen. And I also want to just elevate the fact that women are also often underrepresented in these trials. So I want to turn to what happens after the clinical trials. Even if a vaccine completes phase 3 trials, there could be insufficient data regarding how it affects at-risk populations, Black Americans, the elderly, those with pre-existing health conditions. Dr. Goodman, could the FDA still approve a vaccine that didn't have evidence of safety and efficacy for diverse populations? What are the potential ramifications of doing so?
Well, I think obviously the intent is to prevent that and have diverse populations in these trials. But yes, FDA would look at the data, and let's say one group was underrepresented in it. That could be reflected, for example, in the product labeling or in ACIP's recommendations for how it's used. FDA also can require additional studies after the initial approval. So it's very common, for example, that certain groups, not just minorities, but the elderly are often underrepresented in some trials, and FDA can require studies and data be collected after and submitted. I do think it is very important to get back to one of my comments that we need a robust monitoring system that cuts across all the candidate vaccines as they're rolled out to track data on their safety and effectiveness, because that will tell us about unanticipated problems that might occur in specific subpopulations.
Very good. Well, in closing, I'll just say when a safe and effective vaccine is ready to be distributed, I believe it should be widely accessible and free to all. CDC Director Redfield confirmed to me in one of our earlier hearings that testing and treatment would be free for all. This must also apply to the vaccine, and we must now act to ensure an equitable distribution, especially for the hardest hit communities. Thank you. I yield.
Thank you, Congresswoman Presley. Now I'd like to recognize Congresswoman Miller. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Krishnamoorthi and Ranking Member Cloud, and thank you to all of you witnesses for being here today. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted many issues that exist within our healthcare system. However, the pandemic has also demonstrated what can be accomplished when we develop public and private partnerships committed to finding treatments and vaccines to not only tackle COVID-19, but other diseases as well. I'm encouraged with the administration's commitment to streamlining the process of a vaccine and treatment while definitely ensuring that safety is above all a priority. Operation Warp Speed has been a testament to scientific innovation. Dr. Bhattacharya, a concern regarding the safety of vaccines has been an issue in the United States as well as other countries. As a misinformation campaign continues to grow, what should we do to help combat the deception?
I think there's nothing better than providing good data and good information. Maybe you're talking about the MMR vaccine and autism. I think there the early publication of essentially misleading information was incredibly damaging. So I think in the future, I think like for this the vaccine that comes out of this process, I completely agree with my colleagues on this committee that making the data transparent and available so that everyone can see what the safety concerns are, if there are any, is absolutely critical for the trust of the American public.
Well, it seems that we need to take some kind of additional steps to increase the awareness so that we can help grow the confidence in the integrity of the decisions that are being made right now to the potential of these vaccines. Can you speak to the challenges of developing a pharmaceutical treatment or vaccine for a coronavirus illness?
Oh, it's absolutely enormous. Uh, any vaccine is a difficult challenge. You have to decide what parts of the virus are most amenable to producing antibodies. You have to test whether those antibodies actually do neutralize the virus. All this happens before you even touch any human with it. And then once you start putting into humans, you have to make sure that in small populations, very healthy people, that you're not inducing a safety response, establish appropriate dosing. All this happens in phase 1 trials. Phase 2 and phase 3 trials, you start to test in broader populations, including diverse populations. So it's very important because this vaccine will be very widely deployed to see if there's any special concerns in those populations. You have to have sample sizes that are enormous to make sure that you are seeing safety signals if they exist, to measure the effectiveness, and you have to do it for a sufficiently long period of time so that you have some chance of picking up whether the vaccine is safe and effective. I think under all of those, in normal social circumstances, that would take years. The extraordinary thing about the effort, the scientific effort that's happened now, is that that's happened in just a few months' time. Things that would normally take years. I think it is incumbent on us as scientists to convey to the American public what we're finding and seeing very, very clearly and loudly in terms that people can understand. So if there is no safety signal, if it is effective, we should say that absolutely loudly and not cast aspersions of the vaccine. If there is a safety signal, and if it's not as effective as we hope, we should say that also loudly. I have very full confidence in the scientists that I've worked with at the FDA that they will say what they find in the data. And while the data are produced by companies that are running the trials are under enormous amount of scrutiny, both by the FDA and by the public. There are reporting requirements about the trials. There's guidance that the FDA put out on June 30th about what they expect to see in those trials that include a lot of the concerns that other committee members raised, including the representation of diverse populations, sample size, looking for safety signals. I believe, and maybe I'm being naive, but I don't think so. I think we're going to see a lot of information come out. We'll learn a lot about whether these vaccines work, and we should.
I'd hate to interrupt you, but I want to make the point that when I was a very small child, I remember standing in line at my elementary school with my mother to get the sugar cube for polio. I have friends that have polio, and I'm excited about what the possibilities can be. And I also feel that there are many companies that have agreed to donate millions of doses to the federal government for distribution. And I just want to see what is needed to ensure that those doses are distributed for all Americans across the country.
Yeah, and I think that Operation Warp Speed is a step in that direction, so that we don't have to fight over who gets the vaccine first if it works. Right. So when essentially those doses would get produced in parallel. If the vaccine works, then it's distributed widely. Medicare covers it. Everyone in Medicare gets it for free. If ACIP decides that it's an essential vaccine, then every person with health insurance can get it for free. So I think there are mechanisms in place in health policy to allow those vaccines to be distributed widely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman Miller. And now I'd like to recognize Congresswoman Tlaib. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you
Ready?
so much. Sorry, yes, I know I'm multitasking. I'm so sorry. No, thank you so much, everyone, for being on this call. I mean, I think one of the things I wanted to focus on, and I thank the chairman for this, is to really talk about the effectiveness, right, and safety. But as we all know, is that it seems like it's a good step we towards kind of some transparency and goal setting. But I think, Dr. Karen, I want to start with you with some of the basics. Will a successful vaccine do? What will a successful vaccine do? And how will that phase 3 trials make sure that the vaccine does what it needs to do?
So I think, thank you very much for that question. I think that in the FDA guidance, there are several possible outcomes, outcome measures that could be assessed. I think the most important thing for a vaccine to do is to prevent severe illness and death. And I think the FDA guidance does speak to that and say that at minimum must be a secondary outcome and could be considered as a primary outcome. Other outcomes that can be looked at, but in my personal view are less important, are preventing any COVID disease. Because I honestly think that even a vaccine that prevented severe disease and death, but still allowed mild disease to occur, would not be a failure. We would count that as a success.
And what does the FDA guidelines mean when they say the vaccine must be proven to be 50% more effective than a placebo? I think I'm saying it right.
Yes, 50%, that it must have 50% efficacy. So that what that would mean is that somebody who was vaccinated would have 50% less chance of having a particular outcome, whatever outcome is set in the trial. Yeah, and if I can, could I just make 2 comments about that? Because in some ways, many of our vaccines are 90% effective or 80% effective. And I think maybe the American public might think 50% is a low number. But a couple of things to say about that. One is that frequently what we see with vaccines is that they're more effective against worse disease. So that a vaccine that's 50% effective against a mild disease might be even more effective against severe disease. And the other thing just to say is if we had a vaccine, if we had half the deaths in this country that we've had from COVID, that would still be a major accomplishment.
So, as you probably, I don't know, folks know, but, the subcommittee wrote a letter to FDA that asked for a commitment to 30,000 participants. We haven't received a response yet, I believe, right, Chairman? I don't think we received a response yet. We did? No. But one prominent part of the trial design is the number of participants, but the FDA has been so silent on it. So, Dr., what are the risks of having too few people in the clinical trials? And, one of the things that Dr. Francis Collins and Dr. Fauci endorsed phase 3 trials of at least 30,000 people. Do you agree with them that we need to hit the 30,000 mark? Question goes to Dr. Gillian.
I'm sorry, that question is to me or to?
No, Dr. Is Dr. Gillian?
Me, okay.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's fine. Thank you. I think those are great questions. I think that they were outlined well in the guidance. You heard from Dr. Collins as well. And for the reasons we talked about, it gives you.
No, should it be 30,000 is the question. Should it be 30,000?
I think that's a pretty good number. Particularly because that's going to allow us to look at some of these groups in the population in a robust way. What we often see, and that's the kind of thing that Dr. Karen mentioned at some of the advisory committees is when the data comes through, you say, well, you wish you knew more about some group, and then we'll need to go and look at that. So I think setting that kind of a marker helps to ensure that you have a pretty good evaluation of each of the groups who you expect that will receive this vaccine eventually.
Yeah, and just to last one, because I only have a little bit of time left. Dr. Karen, I saw the work you've done on a vaccine safety and appropriate use for pregnant women. How important is it to include pregnant women in these safety studies?
It's critically important for some of the reasons I mentioned. Pregnant women, the data are still being gathered as to whether pregnant women have more severe disease than their non-pregnant counterparts. There are some data from the CDC that suggest that Black and Latina women may suffer more than other subpopulations of pregnant women. But at the very least, they don't have milder disease than other adults. So they certainly deserve an opportunity to be vaccinated, just like other segments of the population. It's really critically important.
No, thank you both for your answers, and I yield the rest of my time, Chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Congresswoman Tlaib. Now we go to Congressman Connolly. Are you with us still?
Can you see me?
I cannot see. We can see part of you. We can see all of you. There we go. All right. You're recognized for 5 minutes, my friend.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. I want to talk about 2 things, efficacy and risk. Dr. Goodman, how long does it take historically to develop an effective vaccine?
Well, typically, as others have said, that's a several year process. But what we're seeing here,
Dr. Goodman, I have 5 minutes, so let me interrupt
Okay.
you. What's
Yep.
the fastest vaccine ever developed?
Probably the 2009 pandemic vaccines, but as noted, they were based on usual influenza manufacturing and vaccine design. And that was several months.
So several, okay, but for months.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, for example, how long has AIDS been around?
Well, HIV, I was involved in care of the first patients. It's now about 40 years.
Well, actually, it goes back to around 1980, right?
Right.
So that's 40 years.
Right. That's what I said.
Okay. So have we got a vaccine that is efficacious that prevents the transmission of AIDS?
No, HIV has been a really hard target because the body's immune response to that virus is very ineffective.
So the Spanish influenza, maybe that's more of a parallel. That was 100 years ago, 1917, 1918. Do we have a vaccine today that prevents somebody from getting the flu?
We have influenza vaccines. As you know, they change every year based on what strains are circulating. And we also develop vaccines against pandemic threats. Maybe an analogy to this is more like something like Ebola, where in the course of a very accelerated clinical development, a vaccine was available within a few years.
So, but the point is, most flu vaccines help with the severity of the flu. They don't necessarily prevent you from getting the flu. Fair enough?
They do both actually. They're among our less perfect vaccines in that they typically reduce risk of an actual infection. Depending on the population in the year, it could be 20 to 60%. But they are more effective, like you said, at reducing complications and
Right.
hospitalizations.
What I'm trying to get at is we're talking about efficacy as if it's a cure.
Right.
But efficacy isn't always a cure. It is sometimes lessening the severity of the symptoms or preventing the worst from happening, or at least shoring up your immune system so you're better equipped to try to fight off infections. Fair enough?
Yeah, absolutely. And as one of my colleagues just said, if we could reduce mortality or hospitalizations, that would be wonderful.
I understand. But in this conversation, I think we've lost sight a little bit of what efficacy really means. It isn't necessarily a cure, and the history of cures through vaccines is very limited. Dr. Gellin, risk. I'm old enough to remember thalidomide. What can go wrong when you rush a drug to market? That was a simple drug, anti-nausea for pregnant women to make them more comfortable. It led to horrible deformities in the babies that were born. How do we weigh risk here when hundreds of thousands are dying, millions are getting infected? We want to try to end that. What risk is acceptable and what risk isn't? And how do we insulate ourselves politically from the pressure we've seen from this president and this administration to kind of cut corners scientifically already? So, what confidence do we have that we've taken into account risks? I mean, if 20% of the people get vaccinated develop kidney disease, that seems to be a pretty high risk that would be unacceptable. If 1% of them nonetheless get COVID-19, that might be acceptable. Could you talk about that? And then I yield back.
So you had many questions, but they actually all point to the same thing. They point to the process of review. They point to the independent science that the FDA brings to this to look at all that data. And in their decisions and their deliberations, it's always a balance of benefits and risks. Nothing is perfectly safe, and nothing is perfectly effective. And it's that balance that we have to look at here. That's what the process is, and that's why
Mr. Chairman, I know I have just a few seconds. Thank you, Doctor. Could Dr. Schwartz be allowed to answer it as well? I saw him shaking his head vigorously, and I'd like to hear from him, and then I yield back.
I agree entirely with Dr. Gell. These are difficult questions, questions about thresholds, questions about how much evidence is needed. And this is exactly why we need to defer the kinds of structures and expert mechanisms to sort through these very challenging trade-offs that any vaccine presents in the best of circumstances, all the more so given the urgency of a vaccine here. So this is why we have these good systems to think through exactly the questions that you're imagining might come down the line.
Thank you so much, Congressman Connolly. Now, I recognize Katie Porter, Congresswoman Katie Porter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Dr. Gellin, I'm a mom with 3 kids, and I want to make the best possible decisions that I can for their health and for their own and for our community. And that's why every single year we all get our flu shots. We wash our hands, we wear masks. We're doing the right thing because I believe that science works. I believe that vaccines are safe and effective. Now imagine that we're living in a world 6 months from now where the FDA has approved a COVID-19 vaccine for use. But I'm a concerned parent, and I've been hearing a lot that the president pressured the FDA to approve this new COVID-19 vaccine. Dr. Gellin, do you think that I might be nervous about getting this vaccine for my kids if I thought the process was rushed or different than the other vaccines that I routinely and know that are safe for my kids?
For the same reasons, and that the information that comes from these studies is going to help to inform that. I think it also raises the issue of where do you get your information and who are your trusted sources. So I think that another layer here is that while this data is very important and very expert committees will review it, it's critical that the people on the front lines, the doctors and nurses who are going to be delivering these vaccines and who are going to be being asked of questions by you and their other patients, also feel confident in the process. They have to know that it was undertaken in a way that was the way that was going to bring about the best results, and to understand what that was. And they need to be the translators of that information. There's probably no other trusted source than the people who you entrust your health and your children's health to. And if they're not part of the solution, they'll be part of the problem. So another piece of this is to make sure that the data that's going to be reviewed here is translated and provided to the front lines of medicine so they can answer questions like yours.
No, I really appreciate that because I think, most people are not going to be reading medical journals. They're not going to be combing through the FDA website. They're going to be Googling. And they're going to be on Facebook, and they're going to be asking their friends. And you're right to point out that doctors and nurses are, my children's pediatrician has been their pediatrician since they've been born. But I'm also worried that I'm not going to be getting this shot from the kid's pediatrician, that I'm going to be getting it in a mass public health setting. So I think it's really important that the FDA put out that information in an accessible way, including to providers that we could reach out to, of course, by phone. What happens though if people hear these stories about the process being rushed, if doctors say to patients, I actually am not sure this is safe. I haven't gotten the usual information that I get. What happens about only 40 or 50% of the population gets the vaccine because they don't trust it's safe?
Well, unfortunately, the stories you've mentioned are already out there, even before a vaccine is through the clinical trials. And I think that the solution or a response to this is to inoculate against misinformation to the degree that we can, which is not easy to do. That's separate from your question about if not everybody gets a vaccine. Well, there are a lot of mathematical models about what it would take to achieve herd immunity to stop the virus. But I think that if we see that the vaccine is working and see that it's dampening the disease process, I think that will increase the confidence of those who might be skeptical to say, well, actually, it is actually working. And they may rethink a decision that they made previously, which is why that information needs to be critically out there. And we need to make sure that the people on the front lines are able to respond to people's questions like yours.
No, that's really helpful because I think we've seen in the past months what happens when the public doesn't understand or is given any kind of mixed signal about the science behind public health and virus prevention. wearing something as simple as a cloth mask has become an aggressive debate, and social distancing has become more and more controversial. The science is there. Things like wearing masks and vaccines do work, but because we haven't had a clear, decisive message from the federal government about the scientific validity of things like social distancing and wearing masks, they've become divisive. So we cannot risk the same thing happening with a vaccine, because it's so imperative that every person who can get this vaccine, once it's developed, does so. Is there anything more that the FDA should be doing with regard to its guidance to create that kind of public confidence for vaccine adoption?
I think that we've talked about open public process is an important part of it, but also there needs to be an effort to communicate things in a way that people can understand them. Often the language of the experts is not so approachable. So we need to be able to translate that so people can understand what it means. We had that discussion just a few minutes ago about what vaccine means. All of us on the panel could give you all the math behind it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the people who hear it understand it.
Thank you so much,
Thank
and I
you.
love that.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Now, I recognize John Sarbanes. Congressman Sarbanes, you have 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. I want to thank the panel. This has been a very, very enlightening hearing. I appreciate so much the testimony about how we have to balance speed with safety as we pursue these vaccines. I wondered, and I invite any panelist who wants to respond to this, if you could compare this COVID vaccine pursuit with what many Americans are familiar with, which is the sort of the flu vaccine, and maybe compare it in terms of the way the research happens around the flu vaccine, the way that gets administered, the extent of uptake of the flu vaccine in the population. What is the confidence level around the flu vaccine? How do you compare that to what you're seeing in surveys about a potential coronavirus vaccine? And what are some of the practical dimensions of how we would be distributing a COVID vaccine at the same time we would be distributing the seasonal flu vaccine? So since that's the frame a lot of Americans have in terms of a vaccine that comes at them on a regular basis, I wondered if you could draw some comparisons and analogies there on those various topics.
I can address that to some extent. So the flu vaccine, the big uncertainty has to do with what strain of the flu is going to be predominant in the coming flu season. You have to make best guesses about that, but the technology to produce the antibody response, once you've identified what strain you think is going to be predominant, is well established. By contrast, in this case, we don't know how effective the antibody response is going to be from the vaccine candidates. So there's, in that sense, more uncertainty around this vaccine effort than in the traditional flu efforts, the seasonal flu efforts. At the same time, the amount of the number of people in the trials is extraordinary that the FDA is suggesting, and we're going to have a lot of information about whether it works or does not work. To some extent, even more than we have about the traditional flu vaccine when it's deployed in the population. So I think it's both more and less uncertain. In the sense, more uncertain because we don't know about we know what the virus is. Unlike the flu, where we don't know the strain of the virus nominate, but it's less uncertain because we don't know about the antibody response in the same way than we know about traditional.
If I think you've asked a critically important question, because as you said, in people's minds, these are similar. We've read a lot about the great influenza pandemic. We've heard about some parallels, and we expect this to somewhat be like influenza. And that's an important conversation because there are differences. I think you just heard some of those. This figure that we've all seen about flattening the curve, that comes from our work 15 years ago in influenza. You flatten the curve to keep people out of the way of the healthcare system until a vaccine arrives. Because we had decades of experience making influenza vaccines, we knew we could do it. We knew we could get there. It was just matching the strain of the pandemic. This is different. We're flattening the curve to keep people out of the healthcare system while we're working on a vaccine that we don't know will work. And so I think that's a key difference. You ask a number of other questions we could into about distribution, the simultaneous use of vaccine and a COVID vaccine. These are all very important questions that I think that we all need to be working on so that there isn't confusion about these two. Thank you for asking it.
I have 45 seconds. If someone could just speak to this question of confidence in the public relative to the flu vaccine, what is the percentage uptake that we get on a seasonal basis of that vaccine? How does it relate to people's perception of whether it's risky or not risky, or the risk involved in not doing it compared to what you're hearing about their views of the COVID vaccine?
I mean, just quickly, half the population gets a flu vaccine by segments of the population. The confidence is not about safety. The confidence is how well it performs. And there's a lot of work that's been done to try to improve the performance of that vaccine. And that's, if people don't get it, it's probably because of that and not because of any concern they have about a safety profile.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate everybody who participated in today's hearing, especially the panelists. Thank you for a grueling session of question and answers. I also want to just conclude by saying that, we all want a vaccine as soon as possible. I think that goes without saying. And we want to expedite the creation of a safe and effective vaccine. But the only way to do that, and I think there's relative unanimity on this particular point, as I heard from everyone on this panel, is that we should not cut corners at the FDA. Perhaps there might be some efforts to expedite what we do in the manufacturing of vaccines. Perhaps we think about the economics and the prioritization of delivery of the vaccine simultaneously at the creation of such a vaccine. But we must not cut corners and do anything that would hurt or harm the conclusion that whatever the FDA ended up approving is safe and effective. And so I hope that coming out of this hearing, we proceed based on those two conclusions to make sure that the FDA does its job. Commissioner Hahn answers our letter, that he assures us that he will continue to maintain the independence of the FDA, that we will have 30,000 participants in any stage 3 human trial, and that the verb pack be engaged fully in the deliberations surrounding a COVID-19 vaccine. With that, I'd like to thank you all for participating, and this session is adjourned. Thank you.